helpful thing to do to introduce a Christian response to the ecological crisis is to share my own story and to begin there, because I think my own journey is somewhat typical of Western Christians in this regard. So I began my career after doing some theological study at Princeton in Washington, D.C., working for a U.S. Senator, Senator Mark O. Hatfield, who himself was an outstanding Christian and one of the strong opponents of the Vietnam War. I was a very young man, and that's why I was attracted to work for him. So we worked for several years on issues of war and peace around Vietnam, around nuclear disarmament, and also around other issues of justice and humanitarian concern. And from then, I moved to become the associate editor of Sojourners magazine when it was being established in the early days in Washington, D.C. You are probably familiar with Sojourners. It is one of the more important magazines of Christian perspective from today. Even it has a budget of about 5 million and about 42 staff continuing that advocacy work. But in the early days, we were devoting ourselves to the questions of war and peace, and to the questions of justice, concern for the marginalized and poor, and the imperatives of economic justice as understood from a biblical perspective. So those were the issues that really occupied me. I came from an evangelical background, and was very intent on trying to see how my faith related to these pressing issues. My whole life, I'd say, but beginning then, has been an attempt to figure out how my faith, how Christian faith, and how the political order come together and interact with one another in a way that makes some sense. But in about 1979, 1980, after I'd been in D.C. for a dozen years, my wife and I decided to change change our context, and we moved to Missoula, Montana. There was a Christian community there that had been inviting us. We wanted to be a part of it. And at the time, we thought, well, maybe this would be kind of like a sabbatical. We moved to Missoula, Montana. And if you know anything about Montana, I'll just say this. Missoula is the town that houses the University of Montana. It's well known. University of Montana to this day has an exceptional environmental studies program. Also a very strong biblical studies program. Actually, Robert Funk was there, of some fame. And geographically, Missoula is located in the western part of the state, in the Bitterroot, between the Bitterroot Valley and the Mission Valley, and going up to Glacier Park. And there's great environmental concern. So we began to settle into Missoula, and I would notice, I mean, here, the front page of the Missoulian, the local newspaper, would frequently have articles about water quality and how trout were doing in the Clark Fork, and what the status of endangered species were, and what was happening in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and et cetera. I mean, environmental issues were issues that were immediately shaping the context of those who lived there. Now, mind you, for 12 years, I'd lived in inner city Washington, D.C., completely urban environment. Now I'm in an environment that where the natural world is really important because the economy depends on it, tourism depends on it, and there's a great deal of interest in the threats to the environment. I got to know the environmental movement then, and some people in leading environmental spokespersons, and what I discovered was pretty amazing. First, these concerns were seen as real threats to the future of the planet. Now, I mean, the environmental movement had been around, but I'll say honestly, during those times in DC, working with justice and peace issues, I didn't pay much attention. But then the second thing I immediately encountered was that those who were environmental leaders, when I would talk with them or read what they were doing, they would immediately say, "Well, you're a Christian. Christianity is responsible for this environmental mess. It's Christianity that has gotten us into this." And probably the article most often cited is one which I'm sure Chris knows and that you've read, is Lynn White's Historical Roots of the Environmental Crisis. That was, to environmentalists, that was like the Bible for them. I mean, that just laid out how Christianity was to blame. I mean, number one, we have a really severe environmental crisis. Number two, Christianity is really it's that mindset that has gotten us into this. So that presented me with a whole new challenge. I had to ask, well, is this true? I mean, that the environmental crisis is far more pressing than I thought. Now again, this was just 1980, 1981, 1982. But if this was true, is Christianity responsible? And how do I think about this? And how do I respond? And so with a handful of others who were asking these similar questions, and as Joe would know, at that time, the number of Christian theologians, writers, thinkers who were really interacting with the environmental crisis, you could fit them in a closet. I mean, it was incredible. What I've done research since then. I went back to Earth Day. And the first Earth Day, 1970, was when, and Gaylord Nelson, I was working in the U.S. Senate at the time. Gaylord Nelson, famous senator from Wisconsin, he led the charge around Earth Day. You go back and you look at who participated in Earth Day. You can hardly find any church Christian representative there. The Christians were very active in the civil rights movement, very active in the anti-war movement, very active in other issues around economic justice, but you don't find them active at all when the environmental movement starts. And so, but with a few others who shared concerns, I started thinking and writing, and actually, my wife and I, we started an institute called the New Creation Institute, which was just devoted to try to kind of look at this whole problem, and it led to writing my first book. And that book you've already heard of from Kinsley's work. That book was called A Worldly Spirituality: The Call to Take Care of the Earth, and it was published by Harper and Row, and it came out, by the time it was published, it was 1984. And what it tries to do, and Kinsley's summary of it is really good. And the interesting thing, when Chris told me he was using that, I didn't even know I was featured in Kinsley's book. So when I read it through, I said, well, he's done a very good job in capturing what's there. But what I tried to do at that point, and in writing this, and then a couple books that followed, which I'll talk about, I tried to really say, what is the biblical message? My background was such that I knew, most most of the Christians that I knew, their question would be, well, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? And so that's what I wanted to answer. And of course, there were these critiques by Lynn White, by many others. Well, the Bible says subdue the earth, and the Bible says have dominion, and this is what got us into the whole problem. And there's a critique. But when you begin looking at the biblical message, I think you find quite a different story. But even in the Genesis account, you find immediately in what biblical scholars will call the second account of creation, with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, you see that Adam is placed on the earth to till and to keep. There's no sense of dominion and there's a whole other sense. This is a garden, and humanity's job is to till and to keep it. When you even go to the story of Noah and the flood, and I'm not going to get into like how do you really understand this. I'll just say that my own sense is that until you get to the story of Abraham, what comes in the Hebrew scriptures is metaphorical and mythical. It is telling very important stories, but you don't have a sense of real history in terms of what actually happened until I think you get to the account of Abraham. But be that as it may, you know this famous story of Noah and the flood. What is often forgotten is that at the end of the flood, God sends the rainbow. And what is the rainbow? The rainbow is the sign of God's covenant. And who is the covenant between? It's between God and the earth, between all that is created. So the first time this concept of covenant appears in the Bible, it's about God's relationship and promise to the whole creation. And then you follow in Psalms. You look at many of the Psalms. One of the primary ones is Psalm 104, which is one of the most majestic Psalms of creation. And even you look at this prime concept of the image of God, which I think is that's at the heart of so much of our thinking about human rights, about the dignity of every person and so forth. But that concept of the image of God goes even deeper than that. When Old Testament scholars unpack it, they say, well, part of this reference was that at that time, when this was being written, kings, rulers would have statues, images of themselves in places of their realm where they could not be physically present in order to signify their domain, their rule. And to say that humanity is created in the image of God in part means that humanity is placed on earth in order to act out God's intention and God's dominion. And in order to be God's representative, to take care of where they find themselves, which is, again, quite different than the kind of traditional interpretation that you get from many of the critics who look at the biblical story. This continues into the New Testament, and when you unpack, I'm going very fast through a lot of complex things, but when you unpack some of the central ideas, for instance, of shalom and of peace, what you see are these images of wholeness between humanity and creation and the Creator, meant to be in a harmonious whole. And the work of salvation understood as the work of making that whole. And then when you get into the understanding of God's work of redemption through Jesus Christ, well, within Western tradition, we've interpreted that in very, exclusive individualistic terms. And of course, we understand that. But in fact, when you go deeper into simply the New Testament record and scriptures, you see the understandings of creation, which bring together all things into a new whole. The Greek word is ta panta, uh, all things are reconciled. And that doesn't mean just people. It means all creation becomes reconciled and made whole, that's the intention of God's actions in salvation. And that finally, you get this image of the oikos, meaning the household of God, that the earth and all that inhabits it, human and non-human, is a household meant to live together, and that strong word oikos is the word from which both economy and ecology come. The eco part, the ecology is the understanding of the household, the study of it. Anything that has ology, psychology, sociology, and so forth. Ecology is the study of the eco, of the oikos. Economy is the management of the oikos. And you cannot have one without the other. I mean, these things are, in a biblical framework, these things are understood to be intricately connected. So that's, those are the sort of perspectives that I came to in my own journey, and then that I, tried to do in writing. I wrote another book, Ecology and Life, which actually, in that book I had I had White's whole article printed in the appendix, and then responses and rebuttals and some of the whole understanding that I've already been sharing with you here. But then my journey continued, partly because of this work, through a lot of strange circumstances. I got in touch with the World Council of Churches, was asked to come to a conference in Granberg in Norway on the integrity of creation. And this came about because the World Council, which you may know is the global body that unites together about 325 denominations from across the globe. Every 7 years they have an assembly. That assembly sets major themes. In 1983, that assembly was held in Vancouver, Canada. And it said, we want the churches of the World Council to be working in a process, a conciliar process on justice, peace, and integrity of creation. These three things linked together. Well, it sounded beautiful, and someone had just, how these things happen at conferences, someone had come up with this term, integrity of creation. No one knew what it meant. I mean, this was all new to them. So they called this major consultations held in Norway to explore what do we mean by the integrity of creation. And I was fortunate enough to be able to be a part of that. And here are like three of the things I learned from that, which further elaborated my thinking. And it's not just me, but how Christianity approaches the ecological crisis. The first was the importance of the Orthodox theological tradition. Now, I don't know your students how well aware you are of all the different dimensions of Christianity. Joe and I represent Christianity primarily in the Western tradition. I'm a Protestant, Joe's Catholic, all the Christianity that we're familiar with. But there's a whole other tradition of Christianity, commonly called the Orthodox tradition, which traces its history back to the very beginning, and which you find that I don't know what it's like down there in Georgia, but you've probably heard of Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox churches. You have some contact. Well, Orthodoxy is a whole other branch of Christianity. It's particularly strong in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere, and its theological tradition is traced back to the very beginning of Christian faith. It so happens that in 1054, there was a major split between what today we call the Catholic Church and what is the Orthodox Church. And But Orthodox theology, when you go back to whom they call the church fathers, there weren't very many church mothers, but there were church fathers, and they viewed the creation as as carrying God's presence. You could call it a form of panentheism, not pantheism, but panentheism, that the creation exists within God, and their view of the resurrection and of redemption is that the work of God in Christ in the resurrection is one that's designed to redeem the whole creation, to bring the whole creation into fullness. So it's you have, I think Chris has already shared with you, these ideas of the cosmic Christ, which others have picked up. Well, this goes back hundreds of years through the tradition of orthodoxy. That's where you find those themes originally resonating. So that was one voice that I became increasingly impressed with. The second were feminist theologians. There were strong feminist theologians who were at this conference in Norway, and they were bringing, and again, this was 88, so this was some time ago, but they were bringing a reading of the whole ecological crisis from this, through a feminist lens that sees the interdependence of the world and our collaboration, our unity with it. And a reaction against the themes of dominance and rather interdependent. And then much else has been developed in years since by Sally McFay and by many others who have brought insights of feminist theology into ecology. The third voice that was present there, which you've already heard, was the voice of Native and Indigenous people. And in this case, they were Indigenous folks from Christian traditions who were integrating their own cosmology, their own view of the interrelationship of God and all creation as intrinsically bound together through their own, in their case, their own Christian perspective as well. So this further enlarged the way in which Christianity responds to the ecological crisis. The World Council had its next assembly in Canberra, Australia in 1991. And interestingly, the theme of that assembly was "Come, Holy Spirit, renew your whole creation." It was the theme of a whole assembly. And it was there, by this time, I should say, autobiographically, I was asked to come and join the staff of the World Council to head the Division on Church and Society, and specifically to head the work in integrity of creation. That's what they were kind of looking for. And so that meant we got involved at a very early date in the issue of climate change, so that we actually sent a team to observe only the second meeting of the IPCC, the committee that makes all these global reports on climate change. And so it meant that even back then, the churches were trying to accompany the process of looking at the challenges of climate change. To just conclude this introductory part, and so we could have some discussion, what would I say, where do I see this today when I think of the relationship of Christianity to the ecological crisis? Well, the range of ecological awareness and advocacy within the Christian world has exploded. It is so dramatically different than where it was 30 years ago. And most people just don't, they don't get this. You look at the relative void of work being done, certainly in the 70s, and even not much in the 80s. It began to pick up after that, so that now it's fairly common for churches pretty much across the theological spectrum to understand that care of creation is sort of should be pretty important to Christian faith. And you find this now. I mean, I'll be the first to say you're in South Georgia. There are certainly all kinds of strong pockets of more conservative evangelicalism where you've still got climate deniers and you've still got people who are just saying all we're doing is waiting till the end of the age, and when Jesus comes and it's all going to be destroyed anyway, so why do we care about it? Yeah, those voices are there, but the discussion within Christianity overall has changed dramatically, and that includes within evangelicalism. Evangelicalism increasingly is divided. It's become, it's become more of a political and cultural label than a theological one now in the United States. Globally, however, all you have to do is look at the World Evangelical Fellowship. You could go to its website, the World Evangelical Fellowship, and you find what they say about environment and climate change. Go and compare it to what the World Council of Churches says. Go and compare it to what Francis and the Vatican says, and what Laudato Si says, which I'm sure Joe will talk about, the encyclical, the amazing encyclical of Pope Francis. And what you see at a global level is much more across these theological divides, a commonly shared consensus about the need for Christian faith to be engaged in addressing the ecological crisis and climate change. At Glasgow, one of the things, all these groups at Glasgow, there was a huge coalition of Christian groups in Glasgow across the theological spectrum who are united in trying to press Glasgow for very aggressive steps to address climate change. Two other things I would mention, Chris, students. I think, and Joe may go into this when he talks this afternoon. I also increasingly have seen in these past, I would say 20 years, the way in which the contemplative tradition has grown, and has grown within Protestant circles, not just within Catholic circles, but that contemplative tradition, that tradition that seeks a deep sense of discovering our own relationship in unity with God through silence and through contemplative practices. It's people like Thomas Merton and others, and today Richard Rohr, who have really given a lot of profile. But that tradition is at its heart. It says when you enter in this kind of intimate relationship to God, you also enter into a similar relationship with all of creation. And the typical dualism that has so infected the Western tradition, the dualism that comes from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, you've read all about this stuff, that which kind of divides humanity from the rest of creation and divides the spiritual from the material, and we live within this bifurcated framework. That is all overcome from the Christian contemplative. And of course, when you look to other religions, you see the same thing. But I'm talking primarily about how I see this moving within the Christian tradition. And so that's another input that I think increasingly grows. The final comment is that when I first began this work, and even when I first went to the World Council of Churches, I had a lot of colleagues. I remember one of them, Ofelia Ortega, who was from Cuba, and was a great staff colleague. But she brought a Cuban perspective. World Council is made up of churches from all these different traditions, and she would say, Wes, what are you doing worried about, trying to get the churches concerned about this rising sea level and climate change? I mean, don't you know there's economic injustice and oppression. There are people who are on the margins who are suffering economically. And this business about ecology, I mean, that's just a northern issue. It's a privileged issue. It doesn't have any relevance to the life of the real people where we are and where we suffer. And that was a real dialogue in those early days. You don't hear that dialogue now. The term you hear today is environmental justice, because it's become increasingly clear. The intersectionality of these issues is now obvious. And the ways in which the ecological crisis first affects most those who are marginalized and those who are disadvantaged, and that working around ecological issues means also working for justice, and these things are seen much more now, not as a dichotomy, but as part of the same effort. And that I think also has been a major shift that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years. So that's how I would at least try to introduce this time and try to give some indication of how of what I think has been the Christian journey in trying to look at the ecological questions. Now there's a whole separate stream. It's related to this, but a whole separate stream that's moved within the Catholic world. I haven't commented on that because Joe's going to talk about that this afternoon. But I would simply say I think the trajectory is very parallel, even though it's come in different contexts. And I think obviously you've already had exposure, and you'll have more to how these issues are taken up within other religious traditions. There's more and more cooperation across the lines of other living faiths around the ecological question. You find all kinds of examples, but my focus with you today has been to look specifically at how the Christian tradition responds to the ecological crisis, to the issue of ecology, and what, at least in this brief way, what I think its history has been as we look just in recent times over the past, let's say, 40 years. So, Chris, that's about 35 minutes. I think that's enough. I hope to get us started.
Wow, this was great. In such a short period of time, you covered a lot of ground, and I'm very appreciative. I'm pretty sure that you will get many questions and comments from the class and from those who are, by the way, attending today, and including our next speaker today, Dr. Joe Holland, who will be giving a talk at 5 p.m. So with no further ado, maybe we should start with the students in the class, since we have only right now 2 students here face to face. That's why I'm using the mask. And then we will open the floor for those who are connecting with us. So if you don't mind, if anyone has a question or a comment, maybe it would be a good idea, because I don't know if they can hear you well from there. So if you want to come to the front here, so you can bring a question or a comment for Reverend Granberg. And by the way, we are recording this event because I know that many people wanted to listen to your topic today. So do you mind to give us permission to post it in YouTube?
If you think it's worth it.
Of course it is. It was so valuable. I'm pretty sure many people actually will enjoy listening to this wonderful short presentation.
And I didn't say, I brought some props, and I got to introduce one of them to if I'm going to try to describe to you how this really did change in the Christian world. This is the Green Bible. This is the Green Bible. And this Bible was published by Harper One, published by Harper and Row. And it came out in 2008. Okay, so 14 years ago. The Green Bible goes through all the scriptures, and it lifts out in green those areas and those passages that relate to environment and ecology, and it's all over the place. It's all over the place, and it starts with the Canticle to Creatures by St. Francis. It's got some introductory readings by different theologians. In fact, the foreword is by the late Archbishop Tutu, and it is. I lift it up, and the people who were advisory to this include people you would heard of, like Wendell Berry and Brian McLaren and others. And it's it's a, it is the mainline, very respected translation of the Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, but done as the Green Bible to, an attempt to convince people, well, yeah, the Bible does have a thing or two to say about these issues. So that's at least a prop that I think gives you tangible evidence of what I've been trying to say.
Excellent. I'm glad that you found it, because we were talking about it yesterday and you got it. And I talk about this to the students. You remember one day we were discussing the importance of the Bible being almost 70 or whatever percent green. Yeah. So most of the passages actually allude to nature and to the relationship between God and all creatures. So let's open the floor for discussion. If anyone would like to come to the front, please. Who would like to come first? Yeah, Carter. So we have the first student who is going to bring a question or share a comment sure. with you. So I'm going to leave this open so you can also, if you want to sit here. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
So recently I attended a small little movie showing that was happening at the school, and they showed about how there is an uprise in conservative evangelicals getting passionate about the environment and about environmental justice. And I was wondering if you had seen that from your perspective, if there's a lot like intense conservatives that you would traditionally see with like no gay marriage and all of that, if you see a rise in that from your perspective of environmental justice.
Yeah. Thanks. And what's your name?
Carter.
Carter. Thanks, Carter. Thanks very much, Carter. It's a great observation, a great question. I have not seen the movie that you referred to, but I can say that for certain, there's been a growth in conservative evangelical circles around the concern for the environment as a key issue that we should address. Now, as I said, that's not all conservative, evangelical circles. You could find plenty of pockets where you still find, some of the climate deniers and all of that. But the landscape has changed remarkably. There's one person, and I don't know whether Chris, your professor, might have shared with you or not, but there's a person who was also very instrumental in this. His name was Cal DeWitt. Cal DeWitt. You could Google that, look him up. He headed up a group called the Au Sable Trails Environmental Institute, which was in northern Michigan. Cal was an evangelical Christian and head of the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin. So he's an expert scientist. He happened also to be an evangelical Christian. And he's one of the persons who started the effort of trying to gather fellow evangelicals to come and talk about these issues. And he started by getting faculty from different evangelical institutions, often faculty who didn't teach Bible, but who taught biology or who taught environmental studies and so forth. And he began having a series of forums at the Au Sable Institute to get folks together and to explore this. And he was an important voice at that time. I'm looking at my bookcase because one of the sessions that they had, which was in '87, Cal asked if I would put it together and then edit the proceedings that came from it, and that was edited in a book called Tending the Garden, which was published by Erdman's. But for instance, it had people. You wouldn't necessarily know this name, but Lauren Wilkinson, who was at Calvin College and who wrote a famous book on earthkeeping, Robert May, who was at Fuller Theological Seminary, which was a mainline, a main evangelical seminary, Bill Durness, also from Fuller, Robert Johnston, and Paul Brand. So you had some leading evangelical thinkers, even back then, who were beginning to address this. That has continued in, I think, some impressive ways. Try to remember her name. Maybe she was probably in the movie. There's a woman scientist from Texas who has done an amazing job in speaking to evangelical audiences about climate change, and has made a big impact. So if you go to the website of the National Association of Evangelicals, which is the main group linking evangelicals within the United States, you'll see there strong statements dealing with climate and environment. So while I haven't seen the movie, from what you say, there definitely has been a movement in that direction. Now, it's, as I say, it's not the only thing going on within those circles, and increasingly, I think my analysis is that what we understood as evangelicalism is now really fragmenting. It's moving in different directions, partly because of Donald Trump and all of that. But I'd affirm what you saw in that movie, Carter.
Well, thank you.
So we have the next student. He's going to also share with you either a question or a comment. So we have her coming. Isabella is in her way. So let me move these things around. Right. You want to sit here, yeah, so you will feel more comfortable. Yeah. You know? Good.
Hello, I'm Isabella. I just wanted to give a comment. Thank you so much for coming. I think your perspective and analysis is really interesting, especially because I've grown up in a Christian household that has different perspectives on ecology. So this entire class has been really eye-opening for me.
Right.
And I hope that Christianity kind of opens up to these environmental issues.
Well, that's great, Isabella. I came also from a strong evangelical home where, these were just not a part of the conversation. And if they were, it was often in a very skewed way. I was saying to Chris yesterday, Isabella, that we all reveal kind of our age here, but a Republican administration had a Secretary of Interior named James Watt. You could go Google, look him up. So this guy is appointed to be Secretary of Interior, who's supposed to, the Secretary of Interior Department is in charge of all these national forests, all this land, all the, it's apart from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Interior Department has a direct kind of stewardship management of so much of our natural resources. And James Watt was an evangelical, and he would even say, well, when Christ comes again, all this, the world as we know it is going to be destroyed anyway. And so, it's kind of like, well, why should we be? Because this guy was in charge of the Interior Department. I mean, it shows you, like, that would be unthinkable today. But that mindset was there, and especially around this idea of the second coming. If you happen to, I don't know if you can even get it, but if you happen to find a copy of Worldly Spirituality, there's a part in there in which I deal with this issue of eschatology, which simply means the end times, And I try to explain how one group of Christians, for a whole variety of reasons, has had this idea of all we do is we just hang on to the second coming and everything's going to be destroyed and be made new. Well, that's just not what the Bible really says. And there are other strong ways of understanding that. But I think maybe in your household, I know in my household, in the church I grew up in, that was kind of the view. We were just, we weren't too concerned about what was happening on the earth because all we're doing is waiting for Christ to come again. And I think even in evangelical circles that still hold to the importance of the second coming of Christ, even in those circles, the kind of people I've mentioned have ended up issuing a very strong commitment to our obligation before God to take care of the earth.
Yeah, and it made me think of actually kind of like a follow-up question.
Sure, please.
So what have you found is like the best approach to introduce, the concept, because, there's so many different interpretations and sections into Christianity, and the concept is so new. How would you go about doing that?
It depends on who you're talking with, Isabella. I have found, especially when I'm talking to those who come from a more conservative or evangelical background, I've really found that it's most effective to begin with the Bible and to begin going through the Bible in the way that I kind of summarized, and to kind of lift up these verses and stories and perspectives which really do give a view that I think many of those have never heard or seen. We're not aware of it, but every one of us who reads the Bible reads it through our own lens. And often that lens is unconscious. We're just not aware of what we're filtering out and what we're focusing on. And I think I found, at least with those groups, a discussion around what the Bible actually says is really helpful. Other approaches, like you try to convince people that climate change is real and that the environmental crisis, you could kind of try to convince people with facts. Well, that's really important, but for some Christians, they still need to understand, well, then why should we be concerned? And they need to see that, well, actually this really is part of our faith. Other traditions might look more to bringing in different theological strains, different teachers. In the Catholic world, for instance, what Pope Francis has done is amazingly important because of the importance that the Catholic Church gives to what the Pope says, and so yeah, it can kind of differ depending upon the audience. But for me, many Christians have to be convinced that this is part of their biblical faith in order to do something.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Isabella, for your wonderful comments too and questions. So now we can open the floor for anyone who is connected in Teams. So I'm pretty sure, if you don't mind, if you know where to put the raising the hand symbol, which is on the third icon on the right side, on top of the right corner, you can do that, and the person who just raised the hand can get the microphone unmuted. So anyone, let me see, I see one, let's see. Yes, Steve, please go ahead.
I had to get unmuted at first. Isabella made me feel bad. I didn't even think to thank Wes for being here, but thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and that was very, very interesting, and it will be a very valuable addition to YouTube. I promise you, that was very interesting. I don't have much of a question here. Y'all have commented on everything that came to my mind when I thought about that. I've always felt that a Christian obligation is to be a caretaker of the family and the farm and the community and the world in general. So it seems built into the whole religion the ecological approach. We have changed a lot. Now, I remember the Vietnam days and how resistant everybody was to any idea like that. Very natural for people as part of family life now to recycle. Maybe, well, not so much the smaller cars. For a long time we were using cars. I think a lot of people don't read their audience well. I'm not talking about this presentation. I'm talking about people that get a lot of resentment and a lot of pushback because they see you say ecological justice and they're feeling it's ecological vengeance when it's aimed at the person who's struggling to make a living, and they see the political part of it is probably the most pressing and difficult part for people to deal with because it's a sense of imposing authority on people. People very naturally react badly to that. What would you suggest to help people swallow the idea that we're not allowing these countries like China and Russia to go wild with the ecology and go build their coal power plants and their dirty oil and all that, while we are we feel like we're singled out to be the ones to give and to give up and give in. And that's the part where if you're looking at it as authority, it's a very bitter pill. If you're looking at it as doing the part of the caretaker of the planet, that's a different kind of thing. It's hard to get people into that balance and that frame of reference.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. And I mean, my experience has been that you've got to liberate this discussion from the present political trap and that finds itself. I mean, and that's one of the problems when you say, how does Christianity, relate to these issues of public life? The issues of public life now so often get dichotomized by the polarized political discussion we have. And then you try to introduce Christianity, and those whom you're talking to, fellow other Christians, for instance, they immediately view this through the political lens, and so they react exactly how you're saying. And so if you go into one of these, if you go into this discussion and you're trying to kind of justify why Biden's view on climate change makes more sense than Trump's. You're not going to have it with many people. The discussion's not going to go anywhere because immediately that the whole political lens is put on it. But I think you can find entry points. Apart from what I said to Isabella, apart from like just talking to concerned Christians about what the Bible says, there's a very strong case, I think, Steve, to say what is the kind of future that is going to that we want and that we want for our kids, and how do we really, how do we really view these questions about the kind of energy that we use and even the kind of cars we drive, and why what would be a more fulfilling kind of way that could speak to our welfare, because there are really strong, sensible viewpoints that show that sustainability in the long run, it's for all of us. So there's a pragmatic dimension that I think can at least begin some of this discussion if you try to get it out of the political polarized framework that people bring.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna let somebody else. I have to turn the floor over there. And thank you again for coming. It was a lot of time and a lot of effort. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So everyone, make sure that you have the speaker muted because it makes a lot of sound. In this case, Steve, for some reason your computer has something that make a lot of noise and echoes when you are talking, or if you don't mute it, then even the other person cannot hear you well. But anyone has also comment. We have about 15 minutes left. So anyone had more questions, comments to share? I'm pretty sure Dr. Joe Holland is raising his hand, so please go ahead.
I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand. Did I do it, Chris? I see a hand there. Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank you. It's so wonderful to be with Wes. I mean, I used to work about a half a block away from the original home of Sojourners over at the Center of Concern there. So,
oh, wow.
so,
Yeah, that's okay. Now that connects with me.
yeah. So we were neighbors. And it was just wonderful to hear all you've accomplished in your work. Just an honor to be here and be a part of it.
What do you think, Joel, about the, about what you've seen? I mean, I don't want to, you'll go into this later, but how you view the Catholic journey compared to what I was generally outlining?
I wrote this book that I published in 2017 called Postmodern Ecological Spirituality. And by postmodern, I don't mean the normal academic, that of French pro-structuralism or Foucault.
Right.
I mean ecologically, so after the modern and ecological, more leaning toward ecological civilization perspectives. I would say after industrial civilization. After modern industrial civilization, a postmodern ecological civilization. So, But interestingly, I forget the guy's first name. Jenkins was at University of Virginia, and now
Willis
or the reverse, I forget. But he wrote a fascinating essay of three strands of stewardship, and then eco-stewardship, eco-justice, and eco-spirituality.
Yeah.
I was writing my book before Laudato Si, and it was pretty much finished by the time it came out, although it took about 18 months more to get it published. But I was so pleased to see Laudato Si. But I have to say, it's a mixture, predominantly a mixture of eco stewardship and eco justice, and certainly the title of it, caring for our common home, is eco stewardship, and then the idea of integral spirituality is eco-justice, definitely. And at the very end, he calls for ecological education and ecological spirituality.
Yeah.
But he really says almost zero about what it is. So I think that was the area that I've been working on. So I think that's a third strand, and they all be woven together. But surprisingly, and Jenkins identifies eco-spirituality with the Eastern churches. And I would say, people think of the Latin Church or the Roman Church as Catholicism, but there are actually 24 Catholic churches, many of which go back to the time of Jesus. For example, in Saddam Hussein, his foreign minister Tariq Aziz was a Chalcedonian Catholic.
Chalcedonian, yep.
So all the Eastern churches always had what they called theosis, the divinization of nature. And I think that's the foundation for eco-spirituality. The West has really been different and problematic. I think both Catholic and Protestant does have. So I think Lynn White was wrong that Christianity is the cause, but I would say if he had said Western Christianity is the cause, I think he would have been right. And I could talk more about that. And both Catholic and Protestant, the roots of the alienation from spirituality, from natural spirituality, which is originally indigenous, but was kept alive and integrated. And I think we have to say the Jesus background was indigenous. I think it was like, tribal Jewish tribes. It's in a very rural area under imperial oppression. So, but that's the stream that I have worked on, eco-spirituality, both theologically and sociologically and philosophically. So I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But the alienation in the West from nature is very, very deep, very deep. I would trace it to Platonism. The first 1,000 years of Christianity, were East and West, was totally shaped so much by Platonism. Not the pre-imperial church, but the imperial and post-imperial church, East and West. And then it becomes aggravated in the modern period, I think, with the Cartesian thing and the Newtonian thing. But it really, and actually, I put a significant amount of blame on the Benedictines.
Do you really?
Well, Max Weber said, that wrote in, his famous Protestant Ethic, and he blamed Calvin. He didn't use these words, but Calvin as the father of of capitalism. But he also said Benedict was the grandfather, not those words.
Okay.
Really came right out. It was a further development of the rationalization of Benedict monasticism. I mean, they're the ones, I think, that impose this dualism of the secular world, and using Platonic,
right.
The laity are in the secular world, and the religious are in the spiritual world. So there's a double dualism out of the Catholic classical heritage. One is the cultural dualism of the laity being secular, and the monastics being spiritual, coming out of Platonic dualism. And then there's a Roman imperial dualism of politics. The clergy, the kleros ruling over the laos, both of which are unfaithful to the biblical tradition, I think. Both, but they need to be identified, and both of them need to be critiqued. So the Protestant Reformation was just sort of following through on the erroneous foundations from classical and medieval Catholicism. Something different, I think, did happen with the Aristotelian element coming in with the medieval Renaissance from Aquinas. But the roots of that were in the south of Spain, where Cristobal came from, where the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews under Raimundo in the 13th century began to translate Latin from Arabic, the Arabic translations of Aristotle into Latin, aided, by the way, by Celtic scholars who also still had the indigenous traditions and were totally fluent in Greek. They played a major role in midwifing the medieval Renaissance. Actually, one of those scholars later became the head of the new University of Naples, which is today Italy's Harvard. And that's where this young student, Thomas of Aquino, studies. And the head of that, he studies under these Irish scholars. And so they bring from what was in Spain over to Naples, and then he brings it to the University of Paris. And Aristotle was not a Greek. He was not a Greek. He was a Macedonian from tribal traditions, and the Greeks considered them barbarians. So he has this different understanding. Everything is from nature. He has some terrible understandings of nature about natural slaves and women and so on. But his fundamental epistemological approach is from nature, whereas the Platonic approach was flee from nature. Escape. It's astounding to me how powerful the legacy of Platonism still is, because even Ignatius Loyola writes about this in his Spiritual Exercise. The main thing is saving souls. After the fall of Adam and Eve, well, there's no word of fall in the book of Genesis.
Right.
Fall out of the garden, you go out sideways. And so when it's pure Platonism when they talk of the fall of Adam and Eve, and they talk of saving souls, that he thought we're supposed to escape this terrible material world. And that got into Benedictine monasticism. And then it'd be aggravated by the Constantinian, authoritarianism of the kleros. And it was a beginning. So I think the Aristotelian tradition is redeemable, but it has to be. And I see someone like Thomas Berry, he wouldn't ever have said that, but he's like redeeming a new, authentically postmodern, evolutionary and ecological understandings of the Thomist tradition. And actually, Barry took the name as a monk. He took the name Thomas after Thomas Aquinas.
Oh.
So he is. We don't think of him as a monk, but Buddhist monks. But he was a Catholic monk, in the Passion. Or actually, he asked to be buried in his religious habit at the end of his life.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's the ecological spirituality then, and the difference is from the indigenous tradition, which needs, I think that's foundational for all human spirituality. But there in the indigenous tradition is participating in the mystery of panentheism.
Right.
But thanks to evolution, what we have is we're co-creating or co-creating with the Creator. All of creation is co-creating. So it's a new understanding of time, spatial holism with nature. But for the indigenous traditions, it was cyclical. Now it becomes a spiral, I think, of co-creativity. And anyway, I'll talk more about that. That's what the book gets into.
That is
fascinating. A long book. It's very convoluted, and also it has a secondary purpose. If you have any trouble with insomnia, it'll put you right to sleep.
No, that's fascinating. And I have to admit, I haven't seen the book, Joe. I would love to. I mean, there are three comments that occur to me. One is that Willis Jenkins is married to the daughter of one of my best friends. So,
right. Yeah, well, it's very insightful. His work. Yeah.
I've known of Willis through that way, and I think he's done tremendous stuff. And I think that when he spells out those three, one thing I didn't focus on, but I think you pick it up perfectly. The initial way in which Christianity, especially evangelical and others, approached this was through the category of stewardship. And as you see it developed, the stewardship category becomes very inadequate to really interact. But in the first 10, 15 years of concern as it begins developing Christianity, it's largely within that framework. And then it begins to move, not all of it, but it begins to move down that trajectory. So I think you're right. The second thing is that when you talk about the influence of the Celts, I was going to bring up, and I'm sure you're more than familiar, that there are these Christian traditions, not only in Orthodoxy but Celtic Christianity, that comes at this very differently. I did about 3 years ago, I did the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. Yeah. And one of the unbelievable things that I discovered was how the Celts came to Galicia and the whole Celtic influence. I mean, I'm sure Chris, knows all about this, but it mirrors what you were just saying about some of the trajectory of that.
It's even bigger than I have to get a prop to show you, Wes. I may break my leg if I do this. It's way up here. I don't know if I can reach it. Yeah. Wait a minute.
Look out.
There. Okay. I mean, I explore this Celtic thing very much in my book. And Peter Morin,
do you really?
Peter Morin of definitely the Roman powers, and later together with the English crown, they cooperated in destroying the Celtic Church. It was very powerful. The Benedictines were the first ones to work at suppressing it, and because the Benedictines carried the Roman imperial legacy. The Celts evangelized all of Europe, even as far as Austria. Vienna grew out of a development from Irish Celtic monks, and they still have a sign there on the now Benedictine monastery of that. They were incredible. They are the ones who rebuilt Western civilization, not the Benedictines at all. But now they were the indigenous peoples of Europe. Now this is an old National Geographic map. All the yellow spots, they were the dominant indigenous group all across Europe. And of course, Julius Caesar is the one that first destroyed the clan culture of the legal culture the Benedictines in his Gaelic wars, and then the Roman Church followed through on that, and then the British monarchy finally in the Reformation just wiped out the clan tradition and destroyed the Celtic legacy from then on. And then all the seminarians from Ireland, they went and studied on the continent, and they brought back the continental tradition. They lost their own tradition.
Okay.
It was very deliberately destroyed by
really helpful. Yeah.
Very, very powerful. Very powerful.
Huh.
So
Well, thanks, Joel.
Yeah, let me pause for a moment because we are almost, we have only less than a minute left for the class. But since we're going to have Dr. Joe Holland at 5 p.m., so we can continue also the conversation later on and bring more questions and comments. But for those of you who have the time, I can be here connected for a few minutes. I will, of course, dismiss this session now in terms of recording, but if you want to talk to each other, you can do so, and then we can meet at 5 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you for the class. Thank you for Reverend Granberg and for Dr. Holland. I see my friend, Mertonian friend, Jose Andujar from Atlanta, and former students who graduated, Rhonda Reliford, and for our also senior students, Steve Parker and others. So we will meet at 5 p.m. Today, right, and continue this conversation. And just to leave you with a thought, this is good news because, believe it or not, we have Catholics and Protestants agreeing on many things and sharing many things in common. And this is our common house. This is our common beautiful earth. And we should do better than we have done in the past. Like Father Thomas Berry told me when I was a undergraduate student at St. Thomas University, the Catholic Church, of course, is not entirely the one to be blamed for the problems, but definitely we have a very bad record, and we need to really do our best to recover from this bad legacy. And that's what I think Pope Francis and many others have tried to do now. And of course, my former professor, Dr. Joe Holland, was like Reverend Granberg, pioneers in their own times. I mean, they have been doing this work now for decades. So I'm very grateful that all of you have done this wonderful job as wonderful representative of Christianity coming from different traditions. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you at 5 p.m. And thank you for coming to this class.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great connecting with you, Joe.
Are we going to stay on for a minute, did you say, or no?
Yeah, you can talk to each other. Let me see if I dismiss this. If it breaks, then I will join. I can call you again in a different session because I'm taping it right now.
I just wanted to add one thing for your students' questions.
Yep.
If we look at the United States culturally, the South is heavily Celtic, but the North was not settled by Celts until late, industrial era, the industrial migrations and so on. But the South has a different culture than the liberal North. And I think that's really important. The evangelization that a lot of people are trying to bring into the South is based on a non-Celtic tradition. I think if you approach the Celts, who were very nature-oriented. It's not surprising people are into hunting and fishing and stuff in the South. They don't have the Protestant work ethic. Very different. And there's a few Southern studies have been written about that.
Fascinating.
And the Southern evangelical, and I worked in Appalachia a lot, which is also heavily Celtic and indigenous. They married each other, interbred. And it's a very important non-imperial Roman form of Christianity. Because even liberal Protestant kept over a lot of the imperial forms of Christianity. So I think if we step back and looked at that, there would be a different way of approaching the tradition. I mean, I think a lot of the Southern pastors are just extraordinary people, and they're very, very close to the people as well. Leave that as a little side note.
Well, thanks, Chris.
Thank you,
Very
Chris.
much, Wes. Thank you, Joe. I already dismissed
Okay.
the previous session, but we will join if you can make it at 5 p.m. Right? We will continue with this wonderful conversation from a Catholic perspective. But if Wes, you can join us, that would be great because you can continue also the conversation and bring different, perspectives as well.
Well, thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to run now to the next class.
Thank you, Carter and Isabella. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, we will see you at just before 5. We will
Okay.
connect, and you can join us in the conversation.
Okay. Bye-bye,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.